Hello everyone, welcome to the studio. It's demo day and we're going to do a video demo today, and I'm going to discuss foregrounds and transitions in greater detail, and then I'm going to do a demonstration of a marsh that has a lot of stuff in the foreground, and we're going to talk about how we can have a more successful entry into the painting and transition into the background by being aware of some important ideas surrounding how to handle foregrounds and transitions. So I just want to say a couple of things first before we get started about foregrounds. A lot of times foregrounds are the part of a painting that we kind of neglect. We don't always pay attention to it because usually we don't have our most important thing in the foreground. And actually that's a good rule of thumb, is you don't want your most important thing right down immediately in the foreground. I'm not saying you can't ever have it that way, but usually you want your most important areas to be further along inside the painting so that you invite the viewer into the painting to enjoy the painting a little bit more. So we tend to neglect this foreground, and then we get to a point in the painting where we're like, oh gosh, I got to do something to the front of the painting, to the foreground. Let me just put in, if we're talking about a landscape, let me just put in some grass. And before you know it, you've overworked the foreground. And oftentimes we create visual barriers to entering the painting. So maybe too many grasses, or maybe even a physical barrier such as a fence or rocks, or whatever happens to be. A lot of times in our photo we have a foreground that has too much stuff, and if we copy that information into our painting, we don't allow the viewer to slip past that. So one of the things that I like to do in my foreground is to keep it simple for the most part, and if I do happen to have a lot of things in that foreground, I want to make sure that I have some sort of entry, and I want the entry point to be subtle. In other words, I don't want to have a wall of grass and then just leave a blank open space. That's a little bit too obvious. We have to finesse it a little bit more so that the viewer doesn't know there's an opening but can feel like they're going through. And I'll talk about that more when I do the demo. So we want to invite the viewer in by having a simple foreground without all the important stuff down there. What happens is the viewer kind of slips past the foreground and moves into the painting and doesn't get hung up by all the stuff that you put in the foreground. Keeping it simple. One of the things that I like to say is I like a dark, simple, warm, or is it dark, warm, simple? I gave it an acronym once before, but keeping it a little bit on the darker side allows us to feel like, oh, I'm moving past that. I don't want to stay there. I want to move into the painting. I want to go towards the light. So I tend to make my foregrounds a little bit darker. Warm is a good way to go, although that's not always a rule of thumb, but a darker, a warmer, and a simple foreground allows the viewer to kind of just ease into the painting and not get hung up at the foreground stuff. So that's number one, keeping your foreground fairly simple. But the next part of the problem is, how do you get that viewer's eye to move around the rest of the painting? You want to invite the viewer past the foreground, but then you don't want to have layers. I like to call this a parfait of grass, trees, mountains, sky, where everything is just kind of stacked up. If you have those elements in your painting, you need to find a way to get that viewer's eye to move into each of those different planes, into those different areas, so that the transition between them is not very obvious. You want it to be subtle. You want it to just gently move from one area to the next. And it's easy enough to do if you're aware of it. If you're thinking about it, then you can be sure that you say, okay, well, here's my foreground, here's my middle ground, and here's my background, but I want there to be a smooth transition. I don't want the viewer to realize they're moving into the next area, and like crossing a bridge. I want it to be subtle. All right, so I'm saying all that, and that's kind of, I don't know if it even makes sense. It's easier to see it in action than it is to explain it. So what I'm going to do is a demonstration painting for you today, and I'll expand upon these ideas. So come over closer, and I'll show you what we're going to be working on today. first of all, here's our reference photo. It's kind of hard to see, it's small. It happens to be a marsh scene, somewhere along probably the South Carolina coast. I'm really, what I like about this photo is the various types of grasses and plants and the light, the wonderful warm light that is illuminating these grasses. There's a lot of clutter in the distance. I don't even know what all these lines are here, but I do like that little hint of water and then that little bit of little hints of buildings way in the distance. So this photo is a good candidate for transition and creating depth, as well as treating the foreground, because we have a lot of stuff here and the stuff is interesting, but we don't want to make it too interesting so that we get hung up in that area and we don't pull the viewer's eye into the rest of the painting. Alright, the surface I'm working on happens to be I believe it's a piece of Uart that's mounted, a pre-mounted board. I already had painted something on it, and it was like for a plein air event, and I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to keep that painting, so I just liquefied it with a little alcohol. So I kind of have a really nice greenish background. It was an apple. Yeah. So now I have this kind of out of focus green toned surface that I'm going to work on. I like to reuse my boards and my papers whenever I can, instead of just letting them pile up or even throwing them out if they're not, you know, anything that I really want to keep. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take let's talk about the pastels I'm using. This is what I used for our intro demo. So if you haven't seen the intro demo from July 1st, be sure to watch. I'm using this set of 24 Nupastel, hard pastels, and then my set of Terry Ludwig Floral Landscape pastels. It really just makes it easier. I like to have a really simple, limited palette, and sometimes rather than just selecting pastels out of my larger box, I just pull out this set, and I find I usually have what I need. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these hard pastels. I'll take a brown, and I'm going to very lightly draw the main shapes. Now, this painting is going to be not about the sky, it's more about the grasses. So I'm raising the horizon. I have just a little bit of land back here, and I have a little bit of water. But I can put that little bit of water right on top of my grasses. What I do see, though, is I notice how the light grasses kind of come in a zigzag pattern, which is perfect for helping me lead the viewer into the painting and creating those transition zones. Down here in the foreground, I have some shrubs and some really nice pink grasses. And I'm just making some marks just to let me know that's what I want to put down there. But remember, we don't want it to get too fussy or too carried away with detail. Alright, so there's my initial drawing. I think because I have a toned surface already, I'm going to just block in by value some of the major shapes. Alright, so I'm going to start by blocking in the foreground. Now remember, what did I say a little bit earlier? I like to have a dark foreground. I like to have a dark warm foreground. I'm using a blue, but I'll warm it up when I get going. I'm working here with a very limited palette of hard pastels, so part of that is the challenge. I'm also going to darken up this pathway as it kind of goes through the grasses using a dark purple. And I want to put in, actually I'm going to use the blue to paint the distant land feature right there. Although it's going to be a little bit warmer than that. Alright, we have a very, very light sky. I'm going to go ahead and use a pale yellow to block in that light sky. And I'm going right on top of that green tone paper, so some of that green is peeking through. And now I'm going to go ahead and block in the little bit of water that we see. Now, well, there's all these stripes of water. You know the idea of you're an artist, not a camera, and you have the ability to make changes to your painting. You don't have to copy what you see in the photo. And I don't understand what these stripes are without blowing up the photo. So I don't need to understand. I'm going to eliminate them, but I am going to pull some of the water down. You can kind of see it's peeking through, so I'm going to kind of exaggerate and add a little bit more water right there. Now what I'm going to do is fill in the rest of the areas just with some of these warmer grass colors with the harder pastels. This is just simply the first layer or the underpainting. And I think I'll add some of this yellow ochre to the distant land right back here. One thing about marshes, I know this is not a video about painting marshes, but one tip is if you have a marshland or a wetland and you want it to look like a wetland, you have to make sure that the horizon, or where the land meets the grasses, is perfectly straight and level. If it's not straight and level, it's going to look like rolling hillside, grassy meadow. It won't look like marshland. So that's just something to keep in mind. I like these little pink grasses. I'm going to just put a little pink in there. And then finally there's some nice bright green. Remember, this is just the underpainting, that first layer, just to kind of block in some of the main colors, the main shapes, and kind of get a head start on the painting. Alright, now I can move into the adding the layers of softer pastel. One of the things that I'm going to do right away is spray this whole painting with some workable fixative. And the reason why is I can tell already because I'm working on a reclaimed surface and I've liquefied the pastel with alcohol, it's dried kind of slick. And I've filled in a lot of the tooth of the paper already, which means I'm not going to have a lot of tooth to add many layers. And one of the things I really like about this particular image, and foregrounds in general, is to create texture. And I'm not going to get very much texture if I've already filled the tooth of the paper. So I'm going to seal this first layer with a little workable fixative. But I'm going to do an experiment in this video where I'm going to try to spray some rubbing alcohol rather than using workable fixative and see the difference that I get. So this kind of video is, we're talking about foregrounds and transitions, but I'm also going to do a little experiment here today. Alright, that's dry. Now what am I going to do is I'm going to come in, I'm going to reinforce those dark areas with softer pastel. And I know that if I can use a light enough touch, I'm going to be able to allow a lot of the really pretty colors on the toned surface to peek through and do some of the work. So there's a dark blue. I'm going to come in with a dark violet and very lightly go over these darker areas in the painting. Let's go ahead and add a dark, I'm going to warm it up now, so I'm going to add a dark red violet, kind of a brick red, kind of, especially down here in the foreground. Remember, I want it to be dark and warm and simple. I have that Terry Ludwig eggplant. Ooh, it almost jumped out of my hand. Which is a really nice, warm, super dark. And I'm going to put it in the immediate foreground. I'm not going to move it anywhere else in the painting, and the reason why, I see a little bit of a line from the original board. The reason why is I want to create depth, and I know that things are going to get lighter and cooler and less detailed in the distance, and I don't want to have that same super dark in the foreground and then repeat it in the background because it'll make the background stuff jump forward. All right, now that I have that in place, I'm going to go ahead and work a little bit in a way from top to bottom. Working from top to bottom allows me to keep in mind the need that I have to create a feeling of depth. So I know that things are going to progressively get more detailed, warmer, darker. I'm going backwards now. As I come forward, I'm putting in a little bit of a mauvey purple in this distant landmass. Normally, for distant land, right, I would use a blue-green or even a blue, but this is a very warm, sunny scene, right? It's just saturated with this like warm sunlight, so it's not. It wouldn't look quite as blue. So I pick cooler, duller colors for that, and I also like the way the purple works with the yellows and the pinks that are going to be present in the painting. All right, now I'm going to work on the sky. Actually, I established that distant landmass before I did the sky, because then it allows me to know just how far down I'm going to pull the sky. And I'm going to make my sky a pale yellow, and pale yellow will help unify, or it'll create kind of more of a visual connection to the yellows on the ground. And I wonder if I could put in a little bit of a pale violet. Oops. So I'll put a little bit of a pale violet. I'm tempted at this point, let's see what happens, to use my butterfly fingers just to kind of knit all this together. I don't usually like to blend with my finger. I don't do it very often, but I kind of want to get rid of the darker green that was in the toned surface and just kind of calm down the sky. And one thing that I like to do, if I have blended, and I did it very lightly, you can see I did it very lightly with my finger, I'm going to go over it with some fresh pastel and just kind of add back that luminosity. I'm going to use these same colors in the water, but I'm not going to get to that just yet. Alright, so I'm working my way down. I know that in the distance things are going to be lighter, cooler, duller, fuzzier. So I'm going to start with a really dull grayed down green just to add in there. But I also, here's another kind of grayed down yellow green. And notice what I'm doing is I'm using horizontal marks, and I'm trying to, I'm going to add in a pale yellow. I'm trying to keep the horizontal bands close together in this part of the painting. And then as I come forward, I can make them a little bit wider. Although they're still horizontal, because at this point you're only going to be seeing the very tops of the grasses. You're not close enough to see the uprights, okay? So we're only going to see the very tops of the grasses, so we're using these horizontal bands, and we're using them narrow in the background and gradually getting them fatter. And then as we come forward, as we get closer, add a little bit of green, we can start to rotate the pastel and then go ahead and make some vertical marks. Now, when I talk about transition, we have these horizontal bands and then we transition into the vertical, but if we do it too abruptly, it looks strange. We want to have a better transition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that top color, that yellow ochre, and I'm going to gradually bend my marks from horizontal to the vertical. And that way I might add a little bit here, I have a little bit of a smoother transition. So you always want to be aware of that. I think while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and put in the water while I'm back there. Oops. Well, now my water got a little bit fatter. That's okay. This is actually lighter. And when I am actually painting things like this where I'm trying to create depth and I know I want to really kind of get some interesting texture in the foreground to invite the viewer in, I will work on all of this background stuff and gradually work my way forward, because number one, it allows me to remember that I want to create depth, but number two, the lighter colors aren't going to fall on top of if they fall on top of the darker colors, which they really haven't, I'm not finished with this area, so it's easy to fix. Alright, so let's work a little bit more on getting some color in these vertical grasses. So I'm going to put in a nice yellow green. I think I need to darken some of the, right, especially under where the water is. I want to add some darker shadow areas. And over in here. So I'm using a dark green at this point. Now I'll come back with my yellow green. One thing that's happening, and I can tell, is the board has gotten slick again, right? So I'm not getting everything's kind of starting to mush together. And if you're wondering how you get mud with pastel, one of the easy ways to get mud is when you start mixing the pastel layers physically. They start to combine physically, and when that happens, they mix together and they turn gray, they get muddy, they get dirty. So we want to have clean layers that don't mix physically, they just kind of lay on top of one another. The workable fixative will help do that. A very light touch will help do that. I'm going to try something today. I put some rubbing alcohol in a little spray bottle, and I wonder what would happen if I decided to spray with rubbing alcohol rather than fixative. The reason why I want to try this is because, number one, I haven't done it before, and it seems like, well, you think you would have done that before. You've been painting for, I don't know, since 2005, but I really haven't. And I wonder if I will get the same effect as if I spray my workable fixative, because I know a lot of you can't get this workable fixative, the Blair, and it would be nice to have a substitute, especially if you're doing plein air painting. And I gotta let that dry. I'm gonna go ahead and, if you're doing plein air painting and you don't want to carry a can of fixative, or you can't because you're flying, it would be nice if you could just use rubbing alcohol. So we'll see. Let's see what happens. I like to call that putting on your what if cap. What if I try this instead of that? What would happen if? And a lot of times I am surprised at what the results are. Alright, so we have this really interesting kind of lime green bush right here. Now remember, what don't we want to do? We don't want to get carried away with too much detail, but we want enough detail to make it interesting. So I can tell already that I'm getting, and here's some really cool pink purple grasses. It is actually doing the similar type of thing that I like, the workable fixative. It kind of fixed those darks into place, and now it's allowing me to come over it with a light touch. So actually that's a good experiment. Now, how can I make this foreground interesting without being too busy? Well, I like this bright yellow green bush, so I'm going to add a little more detail with the leaves. But instead of painting every leaf, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I want your eye to come in from the bottom, kind of go to this area, get pulled over here, and then back out of the painting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few leaves that you can see. I don't want to add every single leaf on this bush. There's some more darker ones. I'm going to hint at some others, just making a few marks. I also like these kind of long spiky things over here, but again, I don't want to get carried away. Maybe we should put some over here. A lot of times we think, oh, that looks good, I like that, I should add more. And then we end up overworking it. Remember, we don't want to create a fence, we don't want a visual barrier, we want to invite the viewer into the painting. So we got to be mindful of how much detail we put in. So I like these pink grasses, they're kind of cool. But I don't have the right pink in this set, so I might have to go and grab another pastel. Let me go ahead and do that and I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. What I did was I pulled out my set of Sennelier. Is that what they are? Yes. I worked up with this set the last couple of months, and I'm going to just add the finishing touches because I have a little bit more variety in the pinks in this particular set, and I really want to kind of play up some of these pink grasses, these mauve grasses. So while I said earlier I like to work with a limited palette, depending on what, if you have access to other colors in your studio, why not? It's fine. Oops. I enjoyed working with these. I think they make a good companion to the Terry Ludwigs because these are much softer, and it just kind of gives me, for those finishing touches, I can get some really nice kind of thicker type marks. I'm just rolling to get some of those pinker grasses in. Also, there's some great bright greens in this set. I like this little bit coming off the side there. I can get thicker marks, and that actually, having those thicker marks contrast with the thinner marks of the other previous layers, actually creates much more interesting effects in the foreground. I'm going to hold this so it doesn't bounce around because I'm shouting. So when I shout, I'm pressing much harder, and it just kind of makes my board jump a little bit. Alright, now here's the part where I have to be really mindful about not getting carried away and creating a better transition. So right now I've got quite a lot of stuff going on in the foreground, and I want to be able to move your eye past this stuff. So I'm not pulling it all the way to the ends, but I need to make an opening somehow, and I need to give the viewer some direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to add some light. This will work. I'm going to add some light to these grasses right here. A little bit more going up towards the background. I also don't like how this water is kind of just sticking out. I'm going to add a little bit more light to the tops of these grasses as well. Actually can go a little bit more. These grasses had such beautiful color. I actually see a little bit of pink in some of those grasses as well. So So I'll add a little bit of that mauve to those areas in there. Alright, so now we need to get a little bit more detailed. I'm going to pull out the hard pastels again so I can get some thinner, more linear marks, have a little bit easier time of it. And what I'm trying to do is to get you guys, the viewer, eye, to move beyond and transition to the background. So I'm creating some of these taller grasses right in here over the water so that your eye kind of slips back into the distance. Because if I didn't make that connection, there would be this kind of uncomfortable area where we have the distant grasses and they're not connected in any way to the foreground grasses. Now I did a little bit of bending when I added that first layer and that helped, but I don't think it was quite enough. So by coming in with these harder pastels and making some linear marks, I can kind of enhance that. And now I'm adding some of these pinker linear marks in here to create a little bit of a stepping stone into the painting. So the contrast of this really dark, warm, out of focused area, I'm putting in a few harder edged shouting marks of grasses so that your eye picks up on this and moves into the painting in a little bit more natural way. Or at least that's my goal. Okay, so where am I at? I think I can come in and add just a little bit of brighter greens. Shout some of those brighter greens right in here. Oh yeah, I'm gonna do that. That's a good idea. You're learning. Michael just handed me the butterfly. It was a few months ago I think I showed the butterfly, or... Okay, don't get carried away. 1 mark, 2 marks is good, but then you get carried away and put in too many. Alright, so let's see what's happening. We've got our butterfly. Where will this butterfly land? Right? You want to give a landing spot to the butterfly. So the butterfly is flying around, comes into the painting right here. This is a great spot to rest, but then the butterfly sees these wonderful green things over here, and then you want the butterfly to come over onto this side here. I think what we need to do is just enhance this with a couple of harder edge marks, just a little bit of contrast, and then back out. Now you need something for the butterfly up in here or over in here, and I think what we can do is just put a little bit of a hint of a structure back there, right? So we see that there's just a couple of little buildings in the shadows. Maybe one of them is picking up a little bit of light. I'm using the hard pastels just to make a couple of marks. Let's put a couple of sailboats at the docks right there. I think we need a little guy over there as well. And so now when you go back into the distance, there's something there for you to see. There's something there for you to enjoy. We need to also make sure, remember that horizon line has to be perfectly flat and level. So I'm going to just come in and push with a harder edge on my pastel. And then we need to exit gracefully, so I'm going to just make some linear marks in the sky, some directional marks, just to pull the eye down into the painting from the sky with the hard pastel. So I'm using the hard pastel in a variety of ways. 1, to block in, 2, to create more linear marks, and then 3 as a blending tool. We'll talk more about using hard pastels. But I think at this point I've done enough. I think you can see what is going on. I tried to keep the foreground simple but interesting and use it as an entry point to the painting. And I'll say one more thing. You do not have to have detail all the way to the edges or even on the corners. If you think of there being an oval in the painting, right? Anything outside of the oval is not as important as what's inside the oval. So always keep that in mind. You know, if I were to have grass all the way across and stuff like there is in the photo, I don't think the painting would be as effective. The foreground would not be as effective. So by keeping it simple yet interesting and being mindful of my transitions, then I'm going to have a more successful painting. Well, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed that. I love painting the marshes. It's funny that I selected a marsh painting rather than all the thousands of paintings from my trip, but we will get to those, I promise. This just was a great candidate for our lesson today, and I hope you've enjoyed this demo, and I'll see you next time.